European history. The Russian revolutions of 1917. The Russian revolutions of 1917. Background. The Russian Empire stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea and from Poland to the Pacific Ocean in the east, covering a sixth of the Earth's total land surface. It was a multiracial empire consisting of many nationalities like the Poles, Latvians, Ukrainians, Finns and the Mongols, among others. The empire had an autocratic or absolute system of government known as Tsardom, or the Tsarist regime, and because of this the leaders of Russia had the title of the Tsar. By 1917, Russia was under the leadership of Tsar Nicholas Roman II, who had succeeded Tsar Alexander Roman III in 1894. However, in 1917 Russia witnessed revolutions. The Russian revolutions were violent reactions by the people of Russia against the conservatism and despotism of the Tsardom or Tsarist regime in Russia. The revolutions were two, i.e., one in February or March and the other one in October or November 1917. The one in February or March 1917 overthrew Tsar Nicholas Roman II and therefore led to the collapse of Tsardom in Russia. What followed was the establishment of a provisional government of the Mensheviks led by Prince Lvov and Kerensky. The 1 of October or November 1917 led to the collapse or overthrow of the provisional government and brought in the Bolsheviks under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. Note: the Russian Revolution of 1917 is also known as the Bolsheviks' Revolution of 1917. The causes of the Russian revolutions of 1917. The despotic and harsh nature of the Tsarist regime caused the Russian revolutions of 1917. That Tsars in Russia were dictators and never allowed any degree of democracy. For example, there was no constitution, no freedom of the press, association, as well as no equality before the law. There was also no freedom of worship because the Protestants and Jews were persecuted, while the Orthodox Church was given monopoly over the religious affairs of the Russians. By 1917, Tsar Nicholas Roman II had refused any demand for reforms which generated discontent that sparked off revolution. The rise of socialist reformist or revolutionary parties like the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks led to the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917. These political parties spread socialist ideas demanding for improvement in the general welfare of the masses, which proved to be a solution to people's existing problems like unemployment. They therefore inspired the masses to rise up in 1917. The negative effects of industrialization caused the Russian revolutions of 1917. Industrialization in Russia brought about problems like low pay, overcrowding in factories and poor ventilation, among others. It also increased rural urban migration, which led to urban unemployment and the development of slums with poor sanitation and accommodation. Tsar Nicholas Roman II failed to solve the above problems resulting from industrialization, which caused discontent among the masses, thus sparking off the 1917 Russian Revolution. The weaknesses of Tsar Nicholas Roman II contributed to the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917. He was weak in character and therefore lacked the ability to solve the country's problems. He accepted to be under the influence of his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, who poorly advised him against reforms in Russia. He was a dictator and therefore banned political parties and trade unions. European history. The Russian revolutions of 1917 was very brutal in suppressing the masses. He also failed to cut down corruption, which was widespread in his government. As a result, Tsar Nicholas Roman II became very unpopular among the masses, which finally caused a revolution in Russia by 1917. The negative influence of the Tsarina Alexandra led to the outbreak of the 1917 Russian revolutions. She was the wife of Tsar Nicholas Roman II, but she was very conservative. As a result, she always poorly advised the Tsar to introduce reforms that would have improved the conditions of the ordinary masses in Russia. This increased the unpopularity of the Tsarist government, thus forcing the masses to rise up in 1917. The influence of Rasputin caused the Russian revolutions of 1917. He claimed to be a holy man or monk and a priest. Rasputin was unsympathetic to people's suffering, yet he had a lot of influence on Tsar Nicholas Roman II. He advised Tsar Nicholas Roman II to refuse any demands for reforms like freedom of speech, worship and association. As a result of this negative influence, the masses decided to organize a revolution against both Tsar Nicholas Roman II and Rasputin in 1917. The effects of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 led to the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917. Following the Berlin Congress of 1878, Russian imperialism in the Balkans was checked. Consequently, Russia started expanding eastwards, which brought her into war with Japan by 1904. This war was a disaster to Russia because she was defeated by Japan, leading to the death of many Russian soldiers as well as financial losses on top of losing the strategic Port Arthur to Japan. This increased internal opposition against the Tsarist regime of Nicholas Roman II, which finally sparked off a revolution by 1917. The Russian policy of Russification of the conquered states caused the 1917 Russian Revolution. For example, the Tsarist government under Tsar Nicholas Roman II imposed the Russian language on the people of Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Finland. This generated hatred against the Tsarist government, thus causing a revolution in Russia by 1917. The land problem caused the Russian revolutions of 1917. By 1917, there was an equal distribution of land in Russia, with most of the land owned by the aristocrats and the Orthodox Church. This left the peasants in Russia landless, hence forcing them to rise up in 1917 so as to bring about land reforms that would benefit the peasants. The negative effects of World War I of 1914-1918 on Russia caused the Russian revolutions of 1917. This was a war that was fought between two hostile camps, i.e. the Triple Entente powers and their allies led by France, Britain and Russia against the Triple Alliance or Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey. This war led to the death of many Russian soldiers at the battlefront. The government also spent a lot of money to finance the war, which caused economic problems at home. Tsar Nicholas Roman II continued with the war despite opposition at home. As the war progressed, the soldiers were being forced into the war with poor and inefficient weapons plus lack of training. As a result, most of them died, and those who survived deserted to the army and joined the peasants in causing the revolution by 1917. World War I also resulted into the destruction and occupation of the Ukraine wheat fields by the German forces, and this was a major source of food supply for Russia. This resulted into shortage of food and unemployment in Russia. All these problems forced the masses to rise up against the European history of the Russian revolutions of 1917. Food shortages. This made the government unpopular, thus forcing the peasants to stage a revolt demanding for food and better standards of living by 1917. The role of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party inspired the masses in Russia to rise up in 1917. Lenin drew the attention of the working class to their bad conditions. He was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, which was advocating for socialism in Russia. He advocated for the improvement in the working conditions like better pay, improved factory conditions in the factories. He therefore offered leadership which was vital in making the 1917 Russian Revolution inevitable. The influence of the revolutionary ideologies from Western Europe inspired the Russians to rise up in 1917. Revolutions like the 1789 French Revolution, the 1830 and 1848 revolutions in Western Europe spread ideologies like liberalism into the Russian society. Such ideologies criticized the despotic policies of the Tsarist regime in Russia, thus encouraging the masses to rise up in 1917. The weaknesses of the Russian parliament caused the Russian revolutions of 1917. By 1917, Russia had a parliament which was known as the Duma. However, this parliament had several weaknesses. For example, it failed to bring about the desired reforms. Instead of pressing for reforms, the Duma or parliament just cooperated with Tsar Nicholas Roman II in oppressing the masses. This caused discontent, which finally sparked a revolution by 1917. The inadequate or half-hearted political and economic reforms introduced by Tsar Alexander Roman II led to the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917. He was the Tsar of Russia from 1855 to 1881, and during his regime he introduced many reforms like the Edict of Emancipation of 1861 so as to liberate the serfs or peasants from their landlords, build schools and relax press censorship, among other reforms. However, the reforms were inadequate. For example, the peasants or serfs did not enjoy real freedom and were denied secondary school education. This annoyed the peasants, especially when Tsar Nicholas Roman II continued with the same policy. The impact of the Red or Bloody Sunday of 1905 led to the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917. In January 1905, Father Gapon, a young priest and friend to the workers, led a big crowd of people to the Winter Palace of Tsar Nicholas Roman II in St. Petersburg. The demonstration by Father Gapon was peaceful, and its purpose was to deliver a petition to the Tsar demanding for reforms like better pay for the workers as well as a reduction in the working hours. However, the royal troops, acting on the instructions of Tsar Nicholas Roman II, blocked the demonstration and instead opened fire, and many people were killed. This annoyed the masses, and by 1917 it made a revolution inevitable. The grievances of the army and police made the government unpopular among the soldiers. Tsar Nicholas Roman II failed to improve the conditions of the army. As a result, there was poor pay as well as the continued death of the soldiers during World War I among other grievances. Consequently, there was a mutiny or rebellion of the Cossacks, which was regarded by the Tsar as the more reliable supporters. This encouraged the rest of the masses to rise up against the Tsarist government. The rise of socialism and communism in Russia increased the unpopularity of the Tsarist regime, thus leading to the outbreak of the 1917 Russian revolutions. These two economic ideologies advocated for the state ownership of property like land on behalf of the masses. They also advocated for the improvement in the conditions of the workers in the industries and factories. These ideologies therefore attracted the attention of the masses who were suffering under Tsar Nicholas Roman II. As a European history, the Russian revolutions of 1917. The support from the foreign or European powers contributed to the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917. The European powers like Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland provided funds, manpower, and arms to the revolutionary leaders in Russia like Lenin and Trotsky. Such support inspired the Russians to rise up against the Tsarist regime in 1917. The weaknesses of the provisional government led to the outbreak of the Second Revolution of October 1917. For example, the new leaders continued with fighting in World War I as Tsar Nicholas Roman II had done. The leaders were also weak in their policies, and they failed to solve the social and economic problems that had caused the March Revolution, like unemployment and food shortages. That is why in October 1917, Lenin and Joseph Stalin organized a second revolution which overthrew the provisional government. Effects of the Russian revolutions of 1917. It marked the end of Tsardom and its autocratic rule in Russia after the resignation of Tsar Nicholas Roman II. On 5 March 1917, Tsar Nicholas Roman II was advised to leave or abdicate the throne after the first revolution, and accordingly he abdicated in favour of his grandson Duke Michael. However, the Duke also refused, and that marked the end of Tsardom in Russia. It led to the withdrawal of Russia from World War I. After the revolutions, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, by which Russia was made to withdraw from the war, and this ended the suffering that the war had brought to the Russians. It led to the rise of a government of the peasants and workers Bolsheviks in Russia after the collapse of the Tsarist regime under Tsar Nicholas Roman II. It led to the rise of new men of common origin like Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin, and Stalin in Russia. These men took over leadership in Russia and introduced a number of reforms aimed at addressing the grievances of the masses that had caused the 1917 Russian Revolution. It caused conflicts between Russia and the Western powers, thus leading to the isolation of Russia from European diplomacy between 1917 and 1934. By 1917, nearly all the countries of Western Europe were following capitalism, and therefore there was no way they would relate with Russia, which was following the communist ideology after 1917. As a result, Russia missed the chance of joining the Allied powers in making the post-World War I settlement of 1919 at Versailles. This further explains why Russia was not a member of the League of Nations until 1934. Socialism and communism were established and entrenched in Russia. This therefore led to the elimination of capitalism in Russia. After the revolution, educational reforms were carried out. For example, new schools were set up while the existing ones were improved upon. Such reforms led to the improvement in the educational standards in Russia. It resulted into economic development in Russia. The new government launched the new economic policy NEP, through which industrialization, agriculture and transport were improved upon, thus resulting into economic development. After the revolution, Russia repudiated her foreign debts with other countries. This enabled Russia to concentrate on her domestic affairs. The revolution ended the exploitation of the peasants in Russia. Before the revolution, the Russian European history, the Russian revolutions of 1917. Widespread misery and suffering. With the collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917, this exploitation was ended. It led to the large-scale loss of lives in Russia during the demonstrations and after. For example, it led to the assassination of Tsar Nicholas Roman II and his royal family in July 1918. Similarly, the revolution led to the destruction of property in Russia. During the course of the revolution, a lot of property was destroyed, especially the property of the nobles and the Orthodox Church. It led to the establishment of a new constitution of Russia. This constitution separated the church from the state affairs and also ended the question of the minorities in Russia through the establishment of equality on all nationalities in Russia. This ended the suffering that the minorities had witnessed in Russia before the revolution. The revolution resulted in reforms in the local administration of Russia. For example, local Soviets or committees were established which were elected by universal adult suffrage. It led to the end of feudalism, thus improving the land tenure system in Russia as all the land was nationalized. After coming to power, Vladimir Lenin nationalized all the land to benefit the peasants. Land originally belonging to the government, Orthodox Church and the private landlords was redistributed to the peasants. It led to the birth and spread of communism in Europe. Many European countries, especially in Eastern Europe, adopted communism like Czechoslovakia, Poland and Bulgaria among others. It led to the outbreak of civil wars in Russia between 1918 and 1921. This was a result of the clashes between the White Army of the anti-communists and the Red Army of the Bolsheviks or communists. The communists managed to defeat the anti-communists. This civil crisis in Russia after 1918 resulted into further loss of lives and property. It led to the abolition of the socio-economic inequalities and class divisions that had existed in Russia. Before the revolution, the nobles and clergy had dominated all the important positions in the Tsarist government. After the revolution, the above inequalities were destroyed, which established equality in Russia. It was the destruction of the social class divisions that led men of a humble origin like Lenin to come to power in Russia. It laid a foundation for a modern Russia, especially economically. Russia was transformed into a superpower from a poverty-stricken state. After the revolution, the socialist government developed a number of industries as well as nationalizing the private enterprises. That is why Russia survived that Great Economic Depression of 1929 to 1933. It led to the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany to fight communism. Both ideologies were an outcome of the fear and hatred for communism, especially as the property owners feared the establishment of communist governments in those countries which would nationalize their property, as the case had been in Russia after 1917. It led to the establishment of the one-party system in Russia. After the revolution, the Communist Party became the only party allowed in Russia by law. This therefore denied political liberty to the Russians through political pluralism or multipartism. It led to the abolition of religion in Russia. This was because before the revolution, the Russian European history, the Russian revolutions of 1917, religious intolerance, and this had partly contributed to the outbreak of the 1917 Russian revolutions. They led to the overconcentration of political power in the hands of Joseph Stalin after the death of Vladimir Lenin. Joseph Stalin succeeded Vladimir Lenin in 1924 as the president of Russia, but he concentrated all political powers in his hands, thus entrenching dictatorship in Russia. It led to the loss of Russian territories. The internal disorder caused by the revolution weakened Russia, and therefore she lost her territories or conquered states like Georgia, Finland, Estonia and Latvia among others after World War as they became independent. Reasons for the success of the Russian revolutions of 1917. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas Roman II led to the success of the 1917 Russian Revolution. On 5th February/March 1917, Tsar Nicholas Roman II abdicated the throne in favor of his grandson Duke Michael. However, the Duke and other princes also refused to take over the throne. This marked the end of Tsarist regime in Russia, which eventually led to the success of the 1917 Russian revolutions. The weaknesses of the provisional government led to the success of the 1917 Russian revolutions. This government had been set up by the Mensheviks following the February/March 1917 Russian Revolution, but it had so many weaknesses that made it unable to govern Russia. For example, the new leaders continued with the war policy just as Tsar Nicholas Roman II had done. The leaders were also weak in their policies, and they failed to solve the social and economic problems that had caused the February/March Revolution, like unemployment and food shortages. This inspired Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin to organize a successful revolution in October/November 1917. The execution of the Romanov family, Tsar's family, contributed to the success of the Russian Revolution. In July 1918, the Russian Imperial Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas Roman II, his wife Tsarina Alexandria, and their 5 children were executed by the Bolsheviks, bringing an end to the 3-century-old Romanov dynasty. This therefore contributed to the success of the 1917 Russian revolutions. The popular support by the masses also contributed to the success of the revolution. When the revolution broke out, it was supported by the various sections of the Russian society because they had genuine grievances against the Tsarist government. The revolution was spearheaded by the intellectuals and supported by the peasants together with the workers, which eventually led to its success. The unity among the Russians enabled them to succeed in 1917. They were united under the Bolsheviks party with a determination to establish a socialist government in Russia, which led to the overthrow of the Tsarist government. The support given by the foreign powers enabled the revolutionaries to succeed. The revolutionary leaders like Stalin, Trotsky, Kerensky, and Lenin secured funds, manpower, and arms from some friendly countries like Sweden, Germany, and Switzerland. Germany, for example, supported the revolution in order to cause chaos in Russia so that it could withdraw from World War I against her. That is why Germany smuggled Lenin into Russia in a disguised train. Germany wanted Lenin to overthrow the provisional government and end the war, which he did in October 1917. The role played by the revolutionary leaders like Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin was vital in the success of European history, the Russian revolutions of 1917. Soldiers through their attractive speeches. For example, Lenin promised peace and food, which earned him support that led to the success of the revolution. The success of the new economic policy NEP contributed to the success of the 1917 Russian Revolution. This was the official economic reconstruction program of the Soviet Union Russia from 1921 to 1928. The policy was introduced by the new Soviet government in 1921, through which industrialization, agriculture, and transport were improved upon. This guaranteed the provision of enough food and funds, which contributed to the success of the revolution. The support from the army led to the success of the 1917 Russian Revolution. By 1917, the only remaining instrument for the unpopular Tsar Nicholas Roman II was the army. Unfortunately, when the army was promised an end to the war by the Bolsheviks, they decided to join the revolutionaries, thus leaving Tsar Nicholas Roman II powerless. The support of the minority races in Russia contributed to the success of the 1917 Russian Revolution. By 1917, Russia was a multiracial empire consisting of many nationalities like the Poles, Latvians, Ukrainians, Finns, Lithuanians, and the Mongols, among others. These minorities had been subjected to several injustices which provoked anger amongst them by 1917. For example, the Tsarist language had imposed the Russian language onto them. They therefore decided to support the revolution when it broke out in big numbers, which eventually contributed to its success. The increased economic difficulties in Russia led to the success of the 1917 Russian revolutions. By 1917, Russia was experiencing economic chaos or instability characterized by inflation, increased food prices, and unstable wages, among other problems. These problems provoked anger among the citizens, which forced them to join the revolution in big numbers so as to bring about a change in their living conditions. This eventually contributed to the success of the Russian revolutions of 1917. The use of violence by the revolutionaries made the revolution to succeed. The Russian revolutionaries adopted violence of the Red Terror, which was directed towards those who were against the revolution. For example, in 1919, over 100,000 peasants were executed by the revolutionaries. This policy of terror helped to eliminate any opposition to the revolution, thus contributing to its success. The large number of the Red Army against the small White Army contributed to the success of the 1917 Russian Revolution. Between 1918 and 1921, there broke out a civil war in Russia. This civil war was sparked off by the clashes between the White Army of the anti-communists and the Red Army of the Bolsheviks or communists. However, the communists, who had a very big army, managed to defeat the anti-communists. This therefore facilitated the success of the revolution. Questions. To what extent was Tsar Nicholas Roman II responsible for the outbreak of the Russian revolutions of 1917? Account for the collapse of Tsardom in Russia in 1917.